Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The winter of 1643 had been particularly merciless to the Scottish Highlands, and it was within this frozen wasteland that Dr. Alistair Pemberton first encountered the documents that would forever alter his understanding of political intrigue during the reign of Queen Henrietta Maria. The discovery occurred quite by accident, as most profound revelations tend to do, when renovations at Ravenshollow Manor revealed a hidden chamber sealed behind what appeared to be decorative stonework. Pemberton, a physician and amateur historian from Edinburgh, had been summoned to the estate by its new proprietor, Lord Fitzwilliam, who had recently inherited the property from a distant relative. The manor itself bore the scars of decades of neglect, its Gothic architecture standing like a monument to forgotten grandeur against the stark Highland landscape. What had initially been intended as a routine assessment of the building's structural integrity transformed into something far more significant when workers discovered the concealed room. The chamber, no larger than a modest study, contained what appeared to be the personal effects of someone who had departed in considerable haste. Dust particles danced in the pale winter light that filtered through a single, narrow window, illuminating scattered papers, leather-bound journals, and various implements that suggested their owner had been a person of considerable education and influence. Most intriguing among these artifacts was a collection of correspondence bearing official seals and signatures that immediately captured Pemberton's attention. The name Anne McIntyre appeared repeatedly throughout these documents, though historical records of such an individual seemed curiously absent from conventional accounts of the period. This absence itself proved telling, suggesting either deliberate erasure or the kind of systematic removal that typically accompanies political disgrace. The papers indicated that McIntyre had served in some advisory capacity to Queen Henrietta Maria during the tumultuous early years of the English Civil War, a period when the monarchy's survival depended heavily upon the counsel of those willing to employ methods that more scrupulous advisors might have found distasteful. Pemberton's initial examination revealed correspondence dating from late 1642 through early 1643, a time frame that coincided with some of the most desperate moments of the royalist cause. The handwriting in these letters displayed a peculiar evolution, beginning with the confident, flowing script of someone accustomed to authority and gradually deteriorating into something more erratic and urgent. This transformation suggested mounting pressure or perhaps the gradual erosion of mental stability under circumstances that remained tantalizingly unclear. Among the most significant discoveries was a partially burned journal, its charred edges testament to someone's attempt to destroy evidence of activities that were clearly meant to remain hidden. The surviving pages contained detailed accounts of meetings, strategic discussions, and what appeared to be coded references to operations conducted on behalf of the Crown. The tone of these entries grew increasingly paranoid as the dates progressed, with frequent mentions of surveillance, betrayal, and the constant threat of discovery by parliamentary forces. The physical condition of the hidden chamber itself told a story of hasty abandonment. Personal belongings lay scattered as if their owner had been forced to flee with minimal warning. A writing desk remained partially open, its contents spilled across the floor in a manner suggesting either great haste or considerable distress. The presence of expensive items left behind indicated that departure had been motivated by something more pressing than financial concerns. Weather patterns recorded in contemporary accounts suggested that January 1643 had been marked by severe storms that would have made travel through the Highlands particularly treacherous. This detail added another layer of mystery to the circumstances surrounding McIntyre's apparent disappearance, as few would have chosen such conditions for voluntary departure. The isolation of Ravenshollow Manor, situated nearly 20 miles from the nearest settlement, would have made it an ideal location for someone seeking to avoid unwanted attention. Yet this same remoteness would have posed significant challenges for anyone attempting to leave during winter months. Pemberton's medical training proved invaluable in interpreting certain aspects of the discovery. Several of the documents bore what appeared to be blood stains, though their age made definitive analysis impossible. More disturbing were the implications of various implements found within the chamber, including surgical instruments that seemed oddly out of place among the political correspondence and personal effects. These tools, while consistent with medical practice of the period, raised questions about activities that extended beyond conventional advisory duties. The mystery deepened as Pemberton began to piece together fragments of a narrative that suggested Anne McIntyre's role in the royal court had involved responsibilities far removed from typical diplomatic or administrative functions. References to interrogations, intelligence gathering, and what could only be described as psychological manipulation painted a picture of someone whose loyalty to the crown had manifested in ways that challenged conventional notions of service and duty. As winter darkness settled over Ravenshollow Manor, Dr. Pemberton found himself confronting evidence of events that history had apparently chosen to forget, beginning a journey into the shadows of political intrigue that would test both his scholarly objectivity and his fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and its exercise. Dr. Pemberton's second day at Ravenshollow Manor began with the systematic examination of the correspondence that had survived the apparent attempt at destruction. The letters, arranged chronologically, revealed a progressive descent into activities that challenged his understanding of acceptable conduct during wartime. Each document bore the unmistakable marks of official sanction, yet their contents suggested operations that existed in the murky territories between legitimate intelligence gathering and something far more sinister. The earliest correspondence, dated October 1642, established Anne McIntyre's position within a network of advisors who operated beyond the conventional structures of royal administration. These letters, bearing seals that Pemberton recognized as belonging to high-ranking court officials, outlined assignments that required what the writers euphemistically termed specialized persuasion techniques. The language employed was deliberately obscure, yet patterns emerged that suggested McIntyre's role involved extracting information from individuals whose loyalty to the parliamentary cause made them targets of particular interest. One letter, signed with the initials H.M., and bearing what appeared to be Queen Henrietta Maria's personal seal, contained instructions that left little doubt about the nature of McIntyre's duties. The document referenced the necessity of obtaining intelligence through methods that conventional interrogation has failed to provide, and praised McIntyre's unique understanding of human vulnerability and its practical applications. The Queen's correspondence revealed a monarch willing to sanction activities that her public persona would never have acknowledged. The progression of these letters traced an escalating pattern of assignments that grew increasingly desperate as the royalist position deteriorated throughout late 1642. References to subjects became more frequent, accompanied by detailed discussions of techniques that Pemberton found deeply disturbing despite their clinical presentation. McIntyre's responses, preserved in draft form among the papers, demonstrated a methodical approach to psychological manipulation that suggested extensive study of human behavior under extreme stress. Particularly unsettling was a series of exchanges regarding what the correspondents termed the Whitehall experiments. These documents, heavily coded and partially damaged, appeared to describe systematic attempts to break the psychological resistance of captured parliamentary sympathizers. McIntyre's role in these activities was clearly central, with multiple references to her innovative approaches and remarkable success rates in obtaining information that had previously proven inaccessible. The medical implements discovered in the chamber began to take on new significance as Pemberton examined detailed accounts of interrogation sessions. While the documents never explicitly described physical torture, they contained numerous references to physiological stress indicators and the application of controlled discomfort to enhance psychological receptivity. McIntyre's background, gradually revealed through the correspondence, included training in anatomy and an understanding of nervous system responses that she had apparently adapted for intelligence purposes. A particularly chilling aspect of the documents was their tone of scientific detachment. McIntyre's reports read like medical case studies, describing human subjects with the same clinical objectivity that physicians might employ when documenting disease progression. This dehumanization of her targets suggested a psychological transformation that had occurred gradually, as evidenced by the evolution of her writing style from initial reluctance to eventual enthusiasm for her assigned duties. The correspondence also revealed the existence of a facility referred to only as the Northern Establishment, where McIntyre's most sensitive work was conducted. References to this location suggested a place removed from public scrutiny, where activities could be pursued without concern for conventional moral constraints. The isolation of such a facility would have been essential for operations that required absolute secrecy and the kind of soundproofing that would prevent unwanted attention from nearby populations. As winter deepened around Ravens Hollow Manor, Pemberton discovered evidence that McIntyre's activities had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Several letters bore warnings about parliamentary agents who had begun investigating reports of missing persons, individuals who had disappeared after expressing anti-royalist sentiments. These warnings grew increasingly urgent as 1642 drew to a close, suggesting that McIntyre's operations had become sufficiently notorious to attract official scrutiny. The final letters from this period revealed a growing paranoia within McIntyre's network of correspondence. References to compromised security, potential infiltration, and the need for immediate cessation of current activities painted a picture of an intelligence operation that had begun to unravel. The Queen's own correspondence took on an increasingly distant tone, suggesting that political expediency was beginning to outweigh loyalty to those who had served her cause through questionable means. Most disturbing of all was the gradual emergence of what appeared to be McIntyre's personal transformation. Her later reports contained passages that suggested she had begun to derive satisfaction from her work that extended beyond mere duty to the crown. References to the fascinating complexity of human breaking points and the artistry inherent in psychological dissolution revealed someone who had crossed boundaries that few would have imagined possible. The weight of these revelations settled over Pemberton like the Highland mist, obscuring clear moral distinctions and forcing him to confront the reality that history's shadows often concealed truths that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. The third day of examination brought Dr. Pemberton face to face with Anne McIntyre's personal journal, a leather-bound volume whose pages chronicled a psychological transformation that defied conventional understanding. The journal, partially rescued from the flames that had consumed much of the chamber's contents, provided an intimate glimpse into the mind of someone whose dedication to the royalist cause had led her down paths that few would have dared to traverse. The earliest entries, dating from her initial appointment to the Queen's service in September 1642, revealed a woman of considerable intellect and unwavering loyalty. McIntyre's background, as revealed through these personal reflections, included extensive education in natural philosophy and anatomy, knowledge that had initially been intended for charitable medical work among the poor. Her writing displayed the careful reasoning of someone accustomed to scholarly pursuits, Yet even these early passages contained hints of the pragmatic ruthlessness that would later define her service to the crown. McIntyre's first assignments had involved conventional intelligence gathering, activities that she approached with the methodical precision of a natural scientist. Her journal entries from this period described techniques for reading facial expressions, interpreting vocal patterns, and recognizing the physical manifestations of deception. These observations, initially academic in nature, gradually evolved into something more systematic as she began to understand the practical applications of psychological pressure in extracting information from reluctant subjects. The transformation became apparent through subtle changes in her writing style and the increasingly clinical tone with which she described human behavior. Where early entries had expressed occasional discomfort with the moral implications of her work, later passages revealed a growing fascination with what she termed the architecture of human weakness. Her descriptions of interrogation sessions began to read like scientific experiments, complete with hypotheses about psychological breaking points and careful documentation of results. Particularly disturbing was McIntyre's development of what she called the methodology of graduated pressure. Her journal contained detailed observations about the effects of isolation, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation on her subjects' mental state. These techniques, while stopping short of physical violence, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit human vulnerabilities for intelligence purposes. Her notes revealed someone who had begun to view suffering not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a tool to be wielded with precision and artistry. The journal also documented McIntyre's growing reputation within the Queen's inner circle. References to private meetings with high-ranking officials suggested that her methods, however questionable, had proven remarkably effective in obtaining information that conventional interrogation had failed to produce. The Queen herself had apparently expressed personal gratitude for McIntyre's services, a recognition that seemed to have reinforced her belief in the righteousness of her activities despite their increasingly troubling nature. As autumn progressed into winter, McIntyre's entries revealed an escalating pattern of assignments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable conduct even further. Her subjects were no longer limited to captured soldiers or obvious spies, but included civilians whose only crime had been expressing sympathy for the parliamentary cause. The journal documented her techniques for identifying and exploiting the specific fears and attachments that could be used to break down psychological resistance, methods that demonstrated an intimate understanding of human nature's darker aspects. The most chilling passages described what McIntyre termed the moment of surrender, the psychological instant when a subject's resistance collapsed entirely. Her clinical fascination with this phenomenon revealed someone who had begun to derive intellectual satisfaction from the process of psychological destruction. She wrote extensively about the various factors that influenced how quickly different personality types would succumb to pressure, observations that she organized into what amounted to a taxonomy of human vulnerability. The journal also revealed the existence of detailed records that McIntyre maintained regarding each of her subjects. These files, referenced but not found among the chamber's contents, apparently contained comprehensive psychological profiles that enabled her to tailor her approach to individual weaknesses. The systematic nature of this documentation suggested an operation that had evolved far beyond improvised interrogation techniques into something approaching a science of psychological manipulation. Perhaps most disturbing was the gradual emergence of what appeared to be McIntyre's personal philosophy regarding her work. Later entries contained reflections on the nature of loyalty, duty, and the sacrifices required to preserve the monarchy. She had apparently convinced herself that her activities represented a form of patriotic service that transcended conventional moral constraints. a rationalization that allowed her to pursue increasingly extreme methods without apparent internal conflict. The final entries from December 1642 revealed growing concerns about security breaches and the possibility that her activities had attracted unwanted attention from parliamentary investigators. References to necessary relocations and the implementation of enhanced precautions suggested that the network supporting her operations had begun to feel pressure from external sources, forcing adaptations that would ultimately prove insufficient to protect those involved. As Pemberton closed the journal, the weight of its revelations settled over him like a shroud, forcing him to confront the reality that human beings could rationalize almost any action when convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The fourth day of investigation led Dr. Pemberton to documents that revealed the true scope of Anne McIntyre's operations through detailed architectural plans and operational records of what the correspondents had cryptically referred to as the Northern Establishment. These papers, hidden within a false bottom of an ornate writing desk, provided disturbing insights into a facility that had been specifically designed to facilitate the kind of psychological interrogation that McIntyre had perfected during her service to the Crown. The architectural drawings, executed with professional precision, depicted a structure located approximately 15 miles north of Ravenshollow Manor, built into the natural rock formations that characterize the Highland landscape. The facility's design demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of acoustic principles, with multiple chambers separated by thick stone walls that would have effectively contained any sounds generated within. The layout suggested careful consideration of both security and functionality, with separate entrances for different categories of personnel and subjects. Most unsettling were the detailed specifications for what the plans euphemistically termed consultation rooms. These chambers, varying in size and configuration, had been designed with specific psychological effects in mind. Some featured unusually low ceilings and narrow dimensions that would have created a sense of claustrophobia, while others incorporated architectural elements that would have disoriented occupants through subtle manipulations of perspective and proportion. The attention to psychological detail in these designs revealed a level of planning that went far beyond conventional prison construction. The operational records provided equally disturbing insights into the facility's daily functioning. McIntyre's administrative notes documented a systematic approach to managing what she referred to as subjects under consultation, with detailed schedules that regulated every aspect of their experience. These records revealed that psychological pressure was applied not only during formal interrogation sessions, but through carefully orchestrated environmental manipulations that operated continuously throughout each subject's confinement. Temperature control appeared to have been a particularly important element of McIntyre's methodology. The records documented precise adjustments to heating and ventilation systems, designed to create physical discomfort without causing obvious harm. Subjects were apparently subjected to alternating periods of excessive heat and bitter cold, variations that would have weakened physical resistance while creating psychological stress that enhanced the effectiveness of subsequent interrogation sessions. The facility's staffing records revealed a carefully selected group of individuals whose background suggested they had been chosen for their ability to maintain absolute discretion regarding activities that conventional society would have found abhorrent. Many of these personnel had previous experience in military or medical fields, qualifications that would have enabled them to assist in McIntyre's operations while maintaining the clinical detachment that such work apparently required. Particularly disturbing were the detailed protocols that governed interaction between staff and subjects. These guidelines, written in McIntyre's precise handwriting, established strict procedures designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability regarding the facility's true purpose. Staff members were instructed to behave in ways that would have created constant uncertainty and anxiety among subjects, techniques that demonstrated McIntyre's sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors could be weaponized for intelligence purposes. The records also documented a complex system for categorizing subjects based on their perceived value and the urgency of extracting information from them. Different categories received different treatment protocols, with some subjected to intensive psychological pressure, while others experienced more subtle forms of manipulation designed to operate over extended periods. This systematic approach revealed an operation that had evolved far beyond improvised interrogation techniques into something approaching an industrial process for breaking human psychological resistance. Supply records provided additional insights into the facility's operations, documenting regular deliveries of materials that suggested activities extending beyond simple confinement and questioning. Medical supplies, including various pharmaceutical preparations, indicated that McIntyre's techniques may have included chemical enhancement of psychological pressure. The presence of these substances, combined with her documented medical knowledge, raised questions about methods that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered interrogation rather than systematic torture. The financial records revealed the substantial resources that had been devoted to maintaining the northern establishment, with funding apparently provided through channels that obscured its connection to official royal expenditures. The costs associated with construction, staffing, and operation suggested that McIntyre's activities had been considered sufficiently valuable to justify significant investment, despite the obvious risks associated with discovery by parliamentary forces. Most chilling were the outcome reports that documented the fate of subjects who had passed through the facility. While the language employed was deliberately euphemistic, patterns emerged that suggested many individuals had suffered psychological damage that extended far beyond the temporary effects of conventional interrogation. References to permanent consultation termination and subject disposition through alternative channels implied consequences that McIntyre's clinical documentation had carefully avoided describing explicitly. As winter deepened around Ravenshollow Manor, Pemberton found himself confronting evidence of an operation that had transformed human suffering into a systematic science, conducted with the kind of methodical precision that made its implications all the more horrifying. The northern establishment represented not merely the corruption of individual morality, but the institutionalization of cruelty in service of political objectives that had apparently justified any means necessary for their achievement. The fifth day of Dr. Pemberton's investigation revealed documents that chronicled the systematic collapse of Anne McIntyre's intelligence network during the final weeks of December 1642. These papers, bearing the urgency of increasingly desperate circumstances, painted a picture of an operation that had grown too ambitious for its own security, ultimately attracting the kind of attention that would prove fatal to those involved in its darkest activities. The first indication of trouble appeared in a series of coded messages that referenced the disappearance of key personnel from the northern establishment. These communications, written in a cipher that McIntyre had apparently developed for her most sensitive correspondence, described the sudden absence of individuals whose knowledge of operational details made them significant security risks. The tone of these messages suggested that these disappearances were not voluntary departures, but rather the result of external intervention by forces that had begun to penetrate the network's carefully constructed secrecy. Parliamentary intelligence services, it appeared, had finally begun to piece together the pattern of missing persons that had characterized McIntyre's activities throughout the autumn of 1642. Intercepted correspondence revealed that investigators had identified connections between the disappearances and known royalist sympathizers, leading to surveillance operations that gradually exposed the existence of facilities and personnel that had previously operated beyond official scrutiny. The methodical nature of this investigation suggested that parliamentary forces had developed their own sophisticated intelligence capabilities. McIntyre's personal notes from this period revealed a growing paranoia that manifested in increasingly erratic decision-making and a tendency toward extreme measures designed to protect operational security. Her handwriting, previously characterized by careful precision, began to display signs of stress and haste that suggested mounting psychological pressure. References to necessary eliminations and the implementation of final protocols indicated that she had begun to view former associates as potential threats requiring permanent silencing. The documents also revealed that Queen Henrietta Maria's court had begun to distance itself from McIntyre's activities as reports of parliamentary investigations reached royal circles. Official correspondence from this period adopted increasingly formal language that suggested a deliberate attempt to create administrative distance between the Crown and operations that had become politically dangerous. The Queen's personal seal, which had previously appeared on documents authorizing McIntyre's most sensitive assignments, was notably absent from communications during the final weeks of December. Financial records indicated that funding for the Northern establishment had been abruptly terminated, forcing McIntyre to seek alternative sources of support for operations that required substantial ongoing resources. Her attempts to secure private financing revealed the extent to which her network had become isolated from official channels, leaving her dependent upon individuals whose loyalty was motivated by personal rather than political considerations. This shift in funding sources created additional security vulnerabilities that further compromised operational integrity. The most disturbing aspect of the network's collapse was the systematic elimination of evidence that McIntyre had apparently begun implementing as early as mid-December. Detailed inventories documented the destruction of records, the disposal of equipment, and the relocation of materials that could have provided evidence of activities that would have been impossible to justify through conventional legal channels. The thoroughness of this destruction suggested that McIntyre understood the consequences that would follow discovery of her true activities. Witness accounts, preserved in parliamentary intelligence reports that had somehow found their way into McIntyre's files, described the discovery of abandoned facilities that bore signs of hasty evacuation. These locations, scattered throughout the Scottish Highlands, contained evidence of activities that investigators struggled to comprehend fully. The reports documented the presence of specialized equipment, architectural modifications, and residual materials that suggested systematic human experimentation conducted under the guise of intelligence gathering. The final documents from this period revealed that McIntyre herself had become a target of the same parliamentary forces that had dismantled her network. Intelligence reports indicated that her location had been compromised and that agents were actively pursuing her capture. The isolation that had previously protected her operations now worked against her, limiting her options for escape and forcing her to rely upon resources that were increasingly inadequate for evading professional pursuit. As January 1643 approached, the documents painted a picture of someone whose dedication to the royalist cause had led her into activities that ultimately consumed both her network and herself, leaving behind only the scattered evidence that Dr. Pemberton now struggled to comprehend within the cold confines of Ravenshollow Manor. The 6th day of examination brought Dr. Pemberton to the most harrowing documents in the collection, and McIntyre's final journal entries from January 1643, written during her last days at Ravenshollow Manor. These pages, stained with what appeared to be tears and blood, chronicled the psychological disintegration of someone who had finally been forced to confront the true nature of the activities she had conducted in service to the crown. The entries began on January 3rd, 1643, with McIntyre's arrival at the manor following her escape from the northern establishment. Her writing revealed someone in a state of extreme agitation, haunted by what she described as the accumulated weight of necessary actions that had begun to manifest in disturbing psychological symptoms. Sleep had become impossible, interrupted by what she termed the chorus of consultation subjects, whose voices apparently continued to echo in her consciousness long after their sessions had concluded. McIntyre's isolation at Raven's Hollow had been intended as a temporary refuge, while arrangements were made for her permanent relocation to the continent, where royalist sympathizers might have provided sanctuary beyond the reach of parliamentary justice. However, the documents revealed that these escape plans had been systematically compromised by the same intelligence network that had dismantled her operations. Former associates, facing their own capture and interrogation, had apparently provided information that made her location increasingly precarious. The psychological toll of her activities became evident through increasingly erratic entries that documented a complete breakdown of the rational detachment that had previously characterized her approach to intelligence work. References to spectral consultations and the persistence of terminated subjects suggested that McIntyre had begun experiencing hallucinations that forced her to relive the psychological torture she had inflicted upon others. The clinical precision that had once defined her methodology had been replaced by a chaotic stream of consciousness that revealed the true cost of her systematic dehumanization of others. Particularly disturbing were her attempts to rationalize activities that she could no longer justify through appeals to patriotic duty or royal service. Her entries from mid-January contained lengthy philosophical discussions about the nature of loyalty and sacrifice, arguments that grew increasingly desperate as she struggled to maintain the moral framework that had previously sustained her through the darkest aspects of her work. The collapse of this rationalization left her confronting the reality of actions that she could no longer reconcile with any coherent ethical system. The documents also revealed that McIntyre had begun to suspect that her own elimination had been ordered by the same royal authorities who had previously sanctioned her activities. References to the necessity of operational closure and the implementation of final security measures suggested that she understood her knowledge of sensitive operations made her a liability that could not be allowed to fall into parliamentary hands. This realization appeared to have triggered a complete psychological collapse that manifested in increasingly paranoid and self-destructive behavior. Weather records from January 1643 indicated that the Highland winter had been particularly severe, with temperatures and snowfall that would have made travel virtually impossible for extended periods. This isolation, combined with dwindling supplies and the constant threat of discovery, created conditions that accelerated McIntyre's psychological deterioration. Her entries described a growing obsession with the sounds of the manor itself, which she interpreted as evidence of approaching capture or supernatural retribution for her activities. The final coherent entries, dated January 20th, revealed that McIntyre had begun to hear voices that she attributed to her former subjects, individuals whose psychological destruction she had orchestrated with such methodical precision. These auditory hallucinations apparently provided detailed accounts of the suffering she had inflicted, forcing her to experience her victims' perspectives in ways that her previous clinical detachment had prevented. The reversal of roles, from interrogator to subject of psychological torment, appeared to have completed her mental collapse. Most chilling were her references to the approaching consultation and the final session, phrases that suggested she had begun to view her own impending fate through the same clinical lens she had once applied to others. The irony of this perspective was not lost on her, as evidenced by increasingly fragmented observations about the cyclical nature of suffering and the inevitable consequences of activities that violated fundamental human dignity. As the entries concluded, they painted a picture of someone who had been consumed by the very methods she had perfected, leaving behind only the scattered evidence of a mind that had finally succumbed to the weight of its own accumulated cruelty. The seventh day of Dr. Pemberton's investigation unveiled the most disturbing documents in the entire collection, a series of hastily scrawled notes that chronicled Anne McIntyre's final night at Ravenshollow Manor on January 25th, 1643. These papers, written in increasingly erratic handwriting and stained with substances that analysis would later confirm as human blood, provided a horrifying glimpse into the complete psychological collapse of someone who had finally been forced to confront the full magnitude of her crimes against human dignity. The evening had begun with what McIntyre described as the arrival of the consultation committee, a phrase that initially suggested the presence of actual visitors, but gradually revealed itself to be a reference to the hallucinatory manifestations of her former victims. Her notes documented detailed conversations with individuals she had subjected to psychological torture, discussions that forced her to experience the terror and helplessness she had once inflicted with such clinical precision. The reversal of roles appeared to have triggered a complete breakdown of the psychological barriers that had previously protected her from the emotional consequences of her actions. McIntyre's descriptions of these spectral encounters revealed the systematic nature of the psychological damage she had inflicted upon her subjects. Each apparition apparently confronted her with specific details of their suffering, forcing her to relive sessions that she had previously documented with scientific detachment. The clinical language that had once characterized her reports was replaced by raw emotional responses that suggested she was finally experiencing the human cost of activities she had rationalized as necessary for the preservation of the monarchy. The physical symptoms accompanying these psychological manifestations were documented with the same obsessive attention to detail that had previously characterized her intelligence work. McIntyre recorded elevated heart rate, profuse sweating, and tremors that intensified as the night progressed. Her medical training enabled her to recognize these as symptoms of extreme psychological stress, yet her notes revealed that this clinical understanding provided no protection against the overwhelming terror that had begun to consume her rational faculties. Particularly disturbing were her attempts to conduct what she termed counter-consultations with her hallucinatory visitors, sessions in which she apparently tried to apply her interrogation techniques to the spectral manifestations of her former victims. These efforts, documented in increasingly fragmented prose, revealed someone who had become so thoroughly identified with her role as interrogator that she could not abandon these methods even when confronting the psychological consequences of their previous application. The documents also revealed that McIntyre had begun to suspect that her hallucinations were not merely products of psychological breakdown, but rather manifestations of supernatural retribution for activities that had violated fundamental moral boundaries. Her notes contained lengthy discussions of divine justice and the possibility that her victims had somehow transcended death to exact revenge for the suffering she had inflicted upon them. This interpretation, while clearly the product of a deteriorating mind, provided insight into the guilt that had apparently been accumulating beneath her clinical facade throughout her service to the Crown. As the night progressed, McIntyre's notes documented increasingly desperate attempts to escape the psychological torment that had begun to mirror the techniques she had once employed against others. Her descriptions of isolation, disorientation, and helplessness provided a disturbing parallel to the experiences she had systematically inflicted upon her subjects. The irony of this reversal was not lost on her, as evidenced by increasingly coherent passages that revealed moments of terrible clarity regarding the true nature of her activities. The final entries from that night revealed that McIntyre had begun to understand that her psychological torment would not end with dawn, but would continue indefinitely as the inevitable consequence of actions that had fundamentally corrupted her humanity. Her notes described a growing realization that the clinical detachment she had cultivated as protection against the emotional impact of her work had actually served to amplify the psychological damage by preventing the natural human responses that might have limited her descent into systematic cruelty. Most chilling were her references to the final consultation protocol and the implementation of permanent termination procedures, phrases that suggested she had begun to view her own death as the only escape from psychological torment that had become unbearable. The methodical planning that had once characterized her intelligence operations was now directed toward ending her own existence through methods that would ensure her knowledge of sensitive operations died with her. As dawn approached on January 26, 1643, the documents painted a picture of someone who had been completely consumed by the psychological techniques she had perfected, leaving behind only the scattered evidence of a mind that had finally succumbed to the accumulated weight of its own systematic cruelty and the terrible justice of experiencing her victims' perspectives firsthand. Dr. Pemberton's final day of investigation at Ravens Hollow Manor brought him to the most enigmatic and disturbing conclusion of his historical inquiry. The last document in Anne McIntyre's collection was a single page, written in her characteristic handwriting, but displaying a calmness that stood in stark contrast to the psychological chaos that had characterized her previous entries. Dated January 26, 1643, this final testament provided no clear resolution to the mystery of her disappearance, instead offering only cryptic references that suggested a fate more complex than simple death or capture. The document began with what appeared to be a formal confession, acknowledging activities that she described as necessary violations of human dignity in service to the Crown. However, the clinical language that had previously characterized her reports was replaced by something approaching genuine remorse, suggesting that her psychological breakdown had ultimately led to a recognition of the moral boundaries she had systematically transgressed. Her acknowledgement of responsibility was accompanied by detailed instructions for the destruction of remaining evidence, indicating that she retained sufficient rational capacity to understand the implications of discovery. Most puzzling was McIntyre's reference to the final consultation session, which she described not as her own death, but as a transformation that would allow her to join the committee permanently. This phrase, echoing her previous references to hallucinatory encounters with former victims, suggested either complete psychological dissociation from reality or perhaps something more disturbing that defied conventional understanding. The ambiguity of this language left Pemberton struggling to determine whether he was reading the final words of someone preparing for suicide or documenting an experience that transcended normal psychological categories. The physical evidence discovered throughout the manor supported multiple interpretations of McIntyre's fate. The hidden chamber showed signs of deliberate arrangement, as if someone had carefully prepared the scene for future discovery. Personal belongings were positioned with an almost ritualistic precision that suggested conscious staging rather than hasty abandonment. The presence of her complete documentation, despite previous attempts at destruction, indicated that she had ultimately chosen preservation over concealment, perhaps hoping that future investigators would understand the full scope of her activities. Weather records from late January 1643 confirmed that the Highland winter had reached its most severe point during McIntyre's final days at Ravenshollow. Temperatures had dropped to levels that would have made survival outdoors virtually impossible. Yet no trace of her remains had ever been discovered within the manor itself. This absence of physical evidence created a mystery that conventional investigation could not resolve, leaving only speculation about circumstances that seemed to defy natural explanation. The broader historical context revealed that Anne McIntyre's disappearance had coincided with the systematic elimination of other individuals connected to the Queen's intelligence operations. Parliamentary records, discovered years later, documented the capture and execution of several associates whose knowledge of sensitive activities had made them security risks. However, McIntyre's name appeared nowhere in these official accounts, suggesting either that her fate had been concealed through different means or that she had somehow escaped the systematic purge that had claimed her colleagues. Local folklore, collected by Pemberton during his investigation, contained references to strange occurrences at Ravenshollow Manor that dated from the winter of 1643. Residents of nearby settlements reported unusual sounds emanating from the estate during the coldest nights. Descriptions that bore unsettling similarities to the psychological techniques that McIntyre had documented in her operational records. These accounts, while lacking historical verification, suggested that the manor's reputation for supernatural activity had originated during the period of her residence. The implications of Pemberton's discovery extended far beyond the fate of a single individual, revealing the existence of intelligence operations that had pushed the boundaries of acceptable conduct, even by the standards of a brutal civil war. The systematic nature of McIntyre's activities suggested institutional support for methods that conventional history had failed to acknowledge, raising questions about the true extent of psychological warfare employed by both sides during the conflict. As Pemberton prepared to leave Ravenshollow Manor, he found himself confronting evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. The documents he had discovered painted a picture of someone whose dedication to political ideals had led to activities that ultimately consumed both perpetrator and victims, leaving behind only questions that defied easy resolution. The mystery of Anne McIntyre's fate remained unsolved, preserved within the cold stone walls of Ravenshollow Manor like a testament to the terrible consequences of systematic cruelty and the enduring power of guilt to transcend the boundaries between sanity and madness, between the living and whatever lay beyond the reach of conventional understanding. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.